In this video, I'm going to talk about the top franchise opportunities which are completely passive. Now, let me tell you one thing before we actually get going. I do believe the idea of completely passive businesses is complete BS, right? Most of the time it doesn't exist. A lot of times people try to sell you a fully passive business, especially in the franchise world, when it's not really passive. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the different categories in the franchise world of what's passive, what's not passive, and what I think is actually the best bet. First of all, let's talk about why passive might not work. Number one, if an owner is not actively involved in the business or someone's not actively monitoring it, a competitor is going to overtake you. That's why I think passive businesses in general typically have a high fail rate, right? I think it sounds fantastic of having a business which prints money, you don't have to do anything with it. The reality is this is very, very difficult to do. And in most cases, not worth it, right? You don't need that much extra time to actually have some oversight into a business and catapult it to success. So there's different things you should look for, things you should definitely avoid in the franchise world. One advice I'll give you right out the gate is if any franchise pitches itself as 100% passive, run the other way. It's very difficult to do that, very difficult to execute, and I feel like it increases the risk of failure substantially. Cool, so let's dive into some franchise terminology as well. There's completely hands-off, what's called passive. There's something in the franchise world called semi-absentee. That's basically like where you work part-time, right? You might have something called a designated manager who comes into your franchise business, and that's a manager you hire to run the operations. That's fine. That's not considered 100% passive, but it's also not full-time, right? That's a lot less hours than you normally would work. For example, for MaidThis franchise, one of our franchisees opted to have a designated manager from the very beginning. So he was not actively involved in the business. From the beginning, he just did some marketing things, and he spent, under 5 hours a week on it, and his manager was the one who's managing most of the day-to-day. That's doable, right? That's not 100% passive. You still have someone in it that you've hired from the beginning running it and kind of keeping the engines moving. And also you yourself are doing some work as well, even though it's not full-time. In my opinion, I think that's the best of both worlds. If you are looking for something which is a little bit more hands-off, look for semi-absentee models. What that means is basically part-time, right? The hours scale from, let's say, 10 to 20 on average for a semi-absentee model, but you don't need to be full-time all the time. Oftentimes, I do recommend, hey, you should know what's going on in your business before you outsource it to somebody else. So in that case, maybe at the beginning, you should try to work more hours, learn the skills, hire someone quickly, and then kind of keep going from there. One thing I want to mention, the only way that works is with low-cost franchise models. Why? Because if you can afford to hire, if you want to hire a manager, then this manager is going to cost money. And if you have a ton of CapEx, a ton of debt that you need to pay back, it's going to be very tough for you to hire a manager from the get-go. Therefore, you're going to have to work in the business full-time, right? That's why a lot of very high capital intensive businesses maybe aren't the best fit for a passive type of model. I'm going to tell you one example of a model which is passive, which you might not think about. McDonald's or any fast food joint, for the most part, that's a franchise. Here's why. The people who own it aren't in their day-to-day. They're completely passive, right? They're mostly just investors, maybe just go to collect the rent money, whatever it is. That's essentially all they're doing. But that's because McDonald's is over $1 million in net worth is what you need to even buy into McDonald's. That's the same case for most fast food franchises. These are more real estate type play businesses, which I guess can be passive, but that's because you have enough money to invest in a manager and an entire team from the get-go. And that's what causes it to be passive. So again, if you're looking for something low cost, which is not as time intensive, stay away from fully passive businesses, but look into the semi-absentee model. I'm gonna go over a few franchise models, which I think are great for semi-absentee in industries I generally like, which you could actually look into. So number one, I like anything dealing with services as it relates to having a more hands-off type of approach. So if you look at salons, beauty salons, things like that, most of the time you are not the one doing the work, right? You'd hire that out immediately and maybe just hire a manager from the beginning. This does cost more money, but it's not as capital intensive as like a McDonald's or a car wash even, where it's a massive investment. And the labor is the product, right? You're selling that the person is the hairstylist or the person in the salon selling the service, meaning a little bit less capital intensive. You don't need to buy a bunch of equipment. Like again, you would do it in McDonald's, you do it in a car wash, you do it in a lot of other business models. So salons, beauty salons, things like that, where you're dealing with the service, can potentially lend themselves a little bit better to semi-absentee, or I call it semi-passive. Next would be like yoga and martial arts studios. Why? These are not gyms, which are super capital intensive, which can be very hard to hire a manager, or you need a lot of money to get started, right? A yoga and martial arts studio, if you think about it, there's not much there in terms of capital equipment. It's just a studio, you have an office, or at least rent space, some mats, and you bring in the instructors for the actual classes, right, with the curriculum that the franchise provides to you. So you should be able to, in theory, hire someone earlier on to manage the business for you once you learn the ropes, because there's not as much capital in there and hopefully less debt. So you can have more cash to play with and hopefully more profit. Hire a manager, become some absentee quicker, right? That's another option. Here is one which is a little bit more capital intensive, but more passive in my mind would be laundromats, right? There are laundromat franchises which help teach you things, get you the right equipment, things like that. The equipment and the laundromats are the product, right? You just need someone on site to kind of manage any issues that would pop up, but people come in, they clean their clothes, it's really self-service, relatively passive. Very capital intensive is the problem. So if you have capital, this might be a good business to get into. It can be very highly competitive, but it can be a good niche to get into. So this is one which I would say is a little bit more passive, however, capital intensive as well. Another one which I like, again, is in services, elderly care. So not too many, a lot of elderly care franchises want you to be active in it day to day, going to client's house, things like that. A lot of them don't. And there's two different types of elderly care. One is medical and one is non-medical. Non-medical is where you're not like dispensing drugs to the elderly patient or anything like that. You're just literally there to help take care of them. With something like this, which is services, the technician or the laborer goes straight to the job site. Because of that, you don't need office space, you don't need heavy overhead, which will hopefully increase your profit margin, allowing you to hire a designated manager from the beginning or very soon after you launch. So the labor is the service, right? That's what you're providing is the human who's going to go to the home as well, meaning maybe not as capital intensive until you start getting revenue from them as well. So that's why I like services in general if you're looking for a semi-absentee model or something that's a little bit more passive, because again, you're just banking on the labor, it's not super capital intensive, and hopefully you have money to hire a designated manager rather quickly. Other ones which came to mind is I was looking at a little bit more passive types of franchise models, water filtration systems, vending machines, things like that. If you think about it, relatively passive, right? You have to buy the machine or the filtration system and you have to go and get it set up. How these works is it's route based, right? So someone needs to work the route to, let's say, refill the vending machine or to collect the bills or collect the money for the water filtration systems. So it's not fully passive from the beginning, but hopefully you could eventually hire someone rather quickly to be able to do that route who you trust. These types of businesses though, even though they might pitch them as like work from home, work from anywhere, semi-absentee or fully passive, it's not really, because someone needs to go sell the routes. And that is typically going to be the owner. It's going to be hard to find a salesperson who's highly motivated from the beginning to sell these routes for you. So that's something you have to build from the beginning. But once you build the routes, you can probably hire a technician to go out and, let's say, refill the vending machines or deal with the water filtration systems, things like that. So relatively passive as well. Last one, like I mentioned, would be home services. I think there's a lot of home services which can lend themselves well to a semi-absentee model. You have to check which franchises do this. A lot of them don't allow this. Please be aware of any franchise which says like work from home, work remotely, if not really. Many times they say that to kind of get you in, then you talk to them and you realize like, oh, I actually need to buy get an office space, get a bunch of cars. And remember, the more you have to invest upfront in a more expensive franchise, unless you have a lot of money, it's going to be harder to hire a designated manager. And the only way, in my mind, to get truly passive with a lower cost franchise would be by having a designated manager. So what you want to look at is which franchisees are low cost enough and don't have a ton of capital expenditures afterwards that will allow you to have enough profit to hire a designated manager. And that is actually the secret to having a more passive type of business. So if you guys are interested in looking at a semi-absentee model, check out MaidThis franchise. We're the first and only Airbnb cleaning franchise that exists. Fully remote. I'm currently in South Africa as I record this. I've been running this remotely for about 7 years, as do our franchisees. Everyone runs the business model completely remotely, meaning lower costs, lower overhead, and hopefully more cash available to hire a designated manager so you can be fully hands-off as well. So thanks for watching and catch you on the next video.